Welcome back, and in this video we're going to be covering arrays, which allow us to store a collection of variables of the same type in the same place. And so I've gone ahead and defined an array here for us, and what we can think of them is sort of like a list where we can store a fixed number of elements. So we define it by stating the type of the array that we want. So here we want to store ints, so I've simply put in int there, and then what we do is we actually put in these square brackets here to let Java know that we're going to be using an array. And then, quite similar to how I'll define a normal primitive data type, I put numbers in, which is just going to be the name of my array. I've used numbers because it's a nice clear name and we know exactly what we're doing. And then what I've done is I've said that's equal to something called a new int with a 3 and another bit of square brackets. And what that's saying is this array of type int, which is called numbers, is going to be equal to a new int array with 3 values in it. And so this value here is basically going to be saying how many elements we're going to have within our array. And so that's how we define it. And then we need to be able to access this array because, as you can see, I've said numbers, but then if I wanted to access it, I wouldn't be able to just say numbers equals whatever, like I would with a primitive type, because that could refer to any of the 3 spots. And so we use this syntax here, where we simply say numbers 0 equals whatever it is. So I've just said 1, but I could change that to 5 or 8 or whatever I wanted it to be. So here's where arrays can get a bit weird, and that's because computers actually start counting from 0. So normally you and I would count from 1, but it's something to bear in mind that they think a bit differently in terms of their logic. Hence, when I'm saying numbers 0 is equal to 5, I'm actually saying that the array location 0, i.e. the first element in the array, is going to be set to 5. And then the second array element, or the array at location 1, is going to be set to 2. And so these allow us to refer to the different elements of the array. And the elements basically means the different values within the array. And so arrays are quite similar to numbers, or primitive data types, in that we can actually return them in the same way that we were returning values in the last video when we were looking at functions. And that's why I've created a new function here called createNumberArray. So I've made it private, and that just simply means I don't want it to be visible. I don't want this method to be able to be used by any methods or anything else outside of this class of Java arrays. And then static, because it's going to be used by the class. And then int here. So normally I would put the return type here. So here I'm saying it's an integer array. Here I've initialized my array with the 3 spaces. I am setting up those 3 spaces in the memory of the program, and then I'm merely initializing each of these spaces. And then what happens next is I return numbers. Numbers is the name of the array, and what it will have is the 5, 2, and 3. And so what we can do is I can define another array. So I'm going to call it int array my numbers, and then if I call this function create number array, then what will happen is my numbers will actually be populated with this. So what if we want to print it just to check what numbers we actually have in our array? Well, then we're going to use another method called printArray. And what printArray is going to do is it's going to print out each of the elements. And so I could do system.out.println numbers 0. However, this isn't going to work because of what we mentioned about scopes in the previous videos. And so this array actually only exists inside this function here until we call it and then pass it to this variable here. However, none of these methods have anything to do with this printArray method, and so we need to actually change that. And the way we can do that is by setting an array as a parameter, because they can also work as parameters in our functions as well. And so I'm going to say int and then array, and I'm just going to call it toPrint because it'll be the array we're going to print. And then what I'll do is I can actually change this to the correct name, toPrint. And as we can see, it works as normal. And so now all we need to do is actually just call that. And the way I'd call that is by simply writing printArray, and then I would say what array do I want to print. So in this case, well, I've defined my numbers, so I'm going to call it my numbers. Okay, and even though it says numbers here, it's important to note that we're actually using my numbers because numbers has been set to my numbers, i.e. all the values that are in numbers were copied across to my numbers. And so we can print that, and what we get is hopefully the 0th element, i.e. the first value in the list or the array, being printed out. And as we can see, we set that to 5, and so 5 gets printed out. And so one element's all well and good, but what if we want to print all the elements, which we do? Then we could simply copy and paste this and maybe write a 1 and a 2 here, but that's not really efficient. And if we say had 100 elements in our array, then that would obviously take quite a long time and it would be a lot of unnecessary lines of code. And so what we can actually do is simply just get rid of all of that and put it in a for loop. So I'm going to say int I equals 0, and then whilst I is less than, and so again we have another potential problem. Well, what should it be less than? So we have 3 here, but what if the size of the array changes? What if there's 5 or 6 elements? Because I could put a 3 here for now, but I don't really want to have to change it every time. And so that's where we come to libraries. And what a library is a set of functions that already come along with the array. So it's sort of like a whole bonus package. And what I'm going to do is I can say toPrint dot length. And what that will actually give me is the length of the array. And in this case, it's 3, but sometimes I might want to add a few more elements on, and that would be fine with this because it would change accordingly. And then what I'm going to do is increment I, and then what I'm going to do is system.out.print line, and I'm going to print each element of the array by doing toPrint to refer to the array, and then to refer to the individual elements within the array, I'm going to set this to I. And so what will happen there is I will keep incrementing, and as it goes from 0 to 1 less than the length of the array, because it's doing less than, instead of less than or equal to, it will keep printing out each corresponding element. So it'll start off with 0, then loop through, and then get to 1, then loop through, and get to 2. So if I run this, we should see 5, 2, and 3 all getting printed out. And we do. And now looking over here, we can see that we already knew each of the values that we wanted in our array, and we've set them by accessing each individual element. And like I said before, if we had 6, 7, or 8 elements in our array, which is completely normal, then we would actually have to have 6, 7, or 8 lines of code. And that can be quite long. And a much quicker way we can do this is by simply stating them all when we actually created the array in the first line. And the way we do that is by using squiggly brackets, or our curly braces, and then we simply just put in the values, so 5, 2, and 3. And then these lines of code actually become irrelevant because it's all done here. And as we can see, this is actually a lot easier than setting this. And so if we were to actually run this, we would see we'd get the exact same thing. And it's a lot more convenient because we actually haven't even set the size as well. And that's because Java is smart enough to infer the size of the array being 3 elements without us having to tell it. However, the method you choose is completely up to you. For example, sometimes you may not know all the elements in your array at the start, in which case you could choose to set it up like this and then maybe not set one of your elements, i.e. I could say numbers 0 equals 5 and then numbers 2 equals 3, and then I could leave numbers 1 uninitialized and not have a line of code here. And then what that would mean is numbers 1 would simply just be null until I set it, and null is sort of like the 0 or the default value and essentially means nothing. And we should also note that if we set an array up like this, then we can still access all the elements individually in the exact same way as we were doing before. So for example, I set the 0th location or the first element of the array here to 5, and I could then change it quite easily afterwards to 7. And then if I run that, we can see that this is 7, 2, and 3. And so that's a brief overview of Java arrays, and I'll put all the code that I've used in this video in my Git repository, which will be linked in the description below. Otherwise, I hope you found my content useful, and we'll be going over multi-dimensional arrays in the next video. But until then, please do like, share, and subscribe.